this episode of Botany After Dark. My name is Rin. I am joined by the lovely Fiona over here. We are currently we will be discussing absinthe and fun things of that nature. If you would like to introduce yourself to the masses.
All right, so my name is Fiona Rarig. I have a master's degree from the University of Kent at Canterbury, and it's in ethnobotany. This talks about the relationship between people and plants. And for my master's thesis, I chose to focus on absinthe because there was a little bit of a kind of mysterious relationship there, and I wanted to explore that further.
Very cool. Very cool indeed. All right. So, we've got some questions from people who would be in the audience if this was live. There's some questions that were gathered before everything. So first, someone wanted to know how absinthe generally tastes and if it tastes good.
So taste is really subjective.
Yeah.
So to say that it tastes good, like I think it tastes good, but not everybody will. It said that a good absinthe should remind you of an alpine meadow on a spring day. It should be light, it should be refreshing, it should be kind of cool and a little bit floral. Um, a lot of people will say that absinthe reminds them of black jelly beans. That's not necessarily a good absinthe. That's not necessarily a well balanced absinthe.
Yeah.
That isn't even necessarily one where they're using the proper distillation methods with the proper herbs, such as they are, and we can cover that later. If it tastes like black jelly beans, you're doing something wrong.
Yeah. All right. So, do you have a particular favorite absinthe? And if so, what would it be? Or several?
So, currently, my favorite to drink, I actually have it. It is Wild Card Absinthe.
Oh, nice.
Hope they hit me up. I like this because I would call that it's a chai drinker's absinthe.
Okay.
It's got little hints of cardamom, and paired with the anise and the fennel, it just has a really really nice warming taste to it. So if that spring day in an alpine middle is a little bit chilly, the cardamom just kind of comes in and like warms you up a little bit. I really really enjoy that blend, and even though the cardamom isn't necessarily something that's traditional to absinthe, I really like how it works with it.
Very cool. All right. So you mentioned some with the cardamom and fennel and things like that just now. What plants are generally added to the absinthe? Are they like including what would be used as the base used for anything else? Would it depend on the region that it's from, or just the individual distilleries have particular preference? That sort of thing.
Yes. So all of your absinthe typically contains the holy trinity of absinthe, which is wormwood, it is green anise, and it is fennel. Those three make up the basis of all of your absinthe. Added to that, commonly you'll see hyssop and lemon balm. Those are not just used to flavor the absinthe, but they're actually used in a second phase of the distillation process in order to not just impart flavor, but also to give absinthe its green characteristic color. So those ones are really common. Some people use star anise in their absinthe, but that's part of what can give that kind of black jelly bean flavor to it.
Yeah.
And so if you use too much, it tends to overwhelm everything else. Anethol is an aromatic compound that you typically find in fennel, and it's what you typically find in green anise. And it's usually at a much lower percentage. So we're talking like 12%, versus when you're looking at star anise, you're looking at an ethyl content of more like 88%. Like it's a lot stronger in star anise, and that's one of the
Mhm.
reasons is they'll commonly use that as a flavoring agent for black jelly beans.
Yeah. Yeah. And I realized that I completely missed the like majority of the intro thing, but like I met Fiona when we were doing masters, and I was one of the tester people for part of the experiment. So I remember some of the flavor profiles that you're describing for that, even though it's
It's been
been
a
a couple
minute.
years. But yeah, no, it can confirm. There's, I think there was one in there that had more of an anisey sort of flavor than the other ones, just because.
Yeah.
But there's some that are really light, and there's some that really aren't, depending on what's in it and how it's made, and it's a really cool process.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the things that intrigued me.
Yeah. Um. Also, I remember you mentioning something about there being a difference between how European and American absinthe seems to approach stuff. I don't know if that's an accurate description or.
I don't know that I would say that specifically. But yeah, not
Right.
necessarily between American and European. I have absinthe from both North America and from Europe.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's much more about the distiller and what they're putting in, and less about what country it's coming from.
I think it cut out in the middle of it, but it's fine. We seem to be okay now.
So to recap, um, like the Czech Republic started to come out with this stuff that they were calling absinthe, and I feel like that is a very loose term for what they were coming up with, because it was not necessarily diverse in its flavor profile. It was dyed green as opposed to colored through a second coloring process. They were burning it because that seemed like a crazy fun ritual, even though it was completely historically inaccurate. Um, so there's not necessarily much of a difference based on country, as to what herbs are going into it. It's much more based on the individual distiller and what they've decided to go with.
Sounds good. All right. Okay. So we've kind of gone over how certain plants impact the absinthe flavor.
Mhm.
Um, but are there any that impact how it impact its effects or the properties, whether or not it's more or less not pungent, but strong, I guess, or any number of other designations.
So most of the quote unquote strength that you get from absinthe,
Hmm.
is simply due to its alcohol content.
Hmm.
Um, when you take absinthe, you're taking usually a base of like brandy or vodka. You soak your herbs in that for a bit, and then you put that into a distiller or a still. Excuse me.
Hmm.
The traditional method is using a copper alembic still, and so you take that, and it takes all of your lovely aromatic compounds, and it pulls them up with the alcohol, which then becomes more concentrated. So the stuff that actually is coming out the other end of that still is like 70 to 80% alcohol, um, which then it goes into a coloring phase, um, or not, I suppose, if you're doing a white absinthe.
Yeah.
But characteristically, we know it to be green.
Hmm.
Um, so the strength is usually just due to how strong it is alcoholically. Um, traditionally, what you would do is you would use an absinthe glass, which has a little bulb at the bottom, which holds about an ounce of liquor.
Hmm.
And then you would drizzle ice water onto it, which actually dilutes it significantly, anywhere from like a 1 to 2 ratio to like a 1 to 5 ratio, which will affect how potent it is, but also will affect the flavor.
Hmm.
Generally, you want a little bit more water because that's actually going to help release some of those aromatic compounds into it, so that you can actually taste it better. That's one of the reasons that lighting it on fire is a terrible idea, because all those very delicate aromatic compounds, you will burn the bejesus out of them, and that's just a shame.
So, so you wouldn't recommend the sugar cube on a spoon situation then?
Sugar cubes are actually a matter of personal preference.
Ah,
Some
okay.
people take their absinthe with sugar, some people don't.
Hmm, okay.
Generally, if you've got a bit of a sweet tooth, you might do that.
Sure.
It's not really my thing. I don't
Yeah.
care for sugaring my absinthe. I like to just kind of like taste it and
Yeah.
enjoy it
Yeah.
for the herbal liqueur that it is.
Yeah.
Um, Herbal spirit, technically, it's not really a liqueur, but that's an entirely different matter.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No. I remember in university there was a particular, I don't know, someone ended up with a bottle because it was someone's birthday or whatever, and like, oh yes, we'll do absinthe, yes. So they got a spoon and put a sugar cube on it, like one of the slatted
Hmm.
ones. Held it over the absinthe, lit the sugar cube on fire, and then dumped it in. Like, what are you doing?
That just breaks my heart. Yeah. So that's not the traditional way to enjoy your absinthe. Um, that started in like the 80s with the Czech Republic. They were looking
Yeah.
for something that was like very dramatic. And fire is always dramatic, and people love that. So
Oh
that
yeah.
that became a thing. That should not be a thing. Um, that just kind of it ruins all those nice aromatic compounds that are the entire reason that you drink absinthe to
Oh
begin
yeah.
with. So
It for the compounds, is it like the oils or would it be okay?
yeah, it's primarily the oils. The higher the alcohol content, the easier it is to draw out hydrophobic compounds, compounds that are extracted by alcohol and by oil as opposed to by water.
Hmm. Totally makes sense. Uh, okay. Are probably not, admittedly, because it's a distillation process. But are there different preparation methods that would alter the flavor or other properties involved to get the absinthe, or no?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's technically a couple different ways to make absinthe. You could make it mixing essential oils with alcohol, which is not necessarily a really good idea. There's still going to be some compounds kind of left out
Hmm.
because there's some compounds that you're not going to find in the essential oils. Absinthin is a bitter compound that you usually find at like the end of the distillation process, um, which a tiny bit can kind of flavor that that absinthe with just like a hint of bitterness. And you wouldn't find that in the essential oil. It's too heavy of a compound to come through that process. But also, depending on what kind of an absinthe you want, whether you want a blanche or a vert, a white or a green. If you want a white absinthe, you're not going to put it through a coloring phase. You're just going to go with what you've got. If you
Hmm.
want a green absinthe, you basically put a giant tea bag with lemon balm and hyssop into your absinthe and let it sit for a little bit. If you want a red absinthe, you would do the tea bag method, but with like a ton of hibiscus and just let that sit for a little bit.
Yeah.
And that also imparts a nice kind of fruity floral quality to it, which will also affect the flavor.
I'd forgotten that there was hibiscus in some of them.
There was one red absinthe that I had, and everybody
Yeah.
liked that the most.
Yeah.
And then I think like the next most popular was by Taboo, and theirs comes from a distillery. It's the Okanagan Spirits up in British Columbia, and so they actually get that fruity flavor to their absinthe by using their own vodka that is made from apples and pears, which are sourced locally.
Oh, nice.
Um, yeah, that base really makes a difference because that sweetness comes through,
Hmm.
as opposed to, oh, and there's also, they add chlorophyll as opposed to necessarily going through a coloring phase because they actually filter their absinthe, which removes a bunch of the chlorophyll. So then they add a bit back in at the end process. So they still get the flavor. It's just, I don't know why they filter it out, but and then add the chlorophyll back in. That seems kind of
Yeah.
interesting, I guess, redundant,
Would
like
would there be
interesting,
like
but
a I don't know, a purification process that it needs to go through to filter it, or just
not really.
cause?
Well, and I can understand if they wanted to like extra filter it just to make sure that if anything escaped the tea bag, they didn't have like little bits floating in the bottom of somebody's bottle. Um, I think that just adds character.
Oh, really?
So, I mean, personal preference, I guess.
All right. Cool. Okay. So, going off that, have you made any absinthe yourself?
I have. I have actually made some as part of a research project.
Okay.
I was using a recipe, I believe it's by Edward Duplay. It's like an old recipe from 1901, I think. But it's one of the few recipes that I could find that actually did include star anise,
Mm-hmm.
which was important for my research because there's the Japanese star anise and there is Chinese star anise. And at the height of absinthe's heyday, they hadn't necessarily distinguished between the two. And one of them is very poisonous and the other one is not. So um, my further research has been to distinguish whether or not that would have been responsible for some of the absinthism side effects that we would see.
Would that have something to do with like the psychoactive apparently properties and the brain fairy situation and all that?
Yeah, yeah. So let's see. There's I have done a lot of
Oh,
research
very
on that.
nice.
Um, but there's one article that actually caught my attention because it was talking about the effects of one of the primary compounds of Japanese star anise, and
Hmm.
it was talking that it basically like all of the effects that you would normally see from absinthe, it has, including being known to cause mild hallucinations, which a lot of people were looking at wormwood and its component thuone. But the thing is, thuone doesn't cause hallucinations. Like it just doesn't.
Hmm.
Um, but anisotin, which is the primary compound, does actually cause hallucinations, which is one of the reasons I was like, oh, well, maybe that's the responsible compound. Um, and so my foray into making my own absinthe was really just to try and see, by distilling several different batches with differing amounts
Hmm.
of the Japanese star anise versus the Chinese star anise, whether or not I could actually find that compound in the distillation and if it carried over in that process. And if so, was that enough to just kind of slowly poison a person, um, and just find that out?
Very
So
cool.
I thought so.
Very cool. Experimental research things.
Yes.
So fun. All right. So, going off of that, uh, if the recipe that you're working on, or we're working with, have been working with, however the phrasing would be, uh, is from the very early 1900s. When was absinthe developed? Or do we know? Is that kind of
Yeah.
up in the
Yeah.
air?
So the original recipe for absinthe, um, was developed back in the mid 1700s.
Cool.
Um, so it took about 100 years for it to really hit its heyday. Um, and it actually kicked off because the wine industry was having issues. And so without as much wine, you find a different base for your absinthe, and suddenly the absinthe is a really cheap alternative that people can get drunk off of a lot easier than wine.
There is that. That does tend to move the market when it comes to alcohols.
Well, if you think about it, if this were a bottle of wine, you'd have probably about 4 servings.
Hmm.
This is what, 32 ounces, I think. So if every ounce gives you a serving because you dilute that into a glass, then you have 32 servings of absinthe versus 4 of wine. That's
Very
just
true.
more economical.
It really is. And at least going off the wines that I've tried, it tastes a lot better too.
Generally, I agree.
There's been like maybe one or two that all right, I can drink that, but mostly the uh, the absinthe and
Yeah.
stuff is the better option there. All right. So how has the absinthe creation process changed over time? Because I know
Um,
distillation's been a thing for a while, but
yeah.
yeah.
Um, Overall, it hasn't really changed. I mean, people have been trying to take shortcuts for a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
Even back in its heyday, you would have people who would use like essential oil of wormwood and essential oil of fennel and anise, and use copper salts in order to dye it green and call that absinthe. And I mean, mm, that's a stretch to call that absinthe. But you still have people today who, okay, they're not using copper sulfates to dye their stuff green, which is a lot healthier. But they're not necessarily doing the work and choosing their herbs with care in order
Mm-hmm.
to make absinthe. Sometimes it's not even really herbs, it's just flavor extracts. Um, Seems like a cheater's method to me, honestly. But I've got high standards.
I mean, accurate though. All right. So progressing from there, what's the weirdest thing that you've seen or heard people make or attempt to make alcohol out of? Whether it's absinthe specifically or just in general.
Um, so for absinthe specifically, actually, this guy is a bit more of like a nouveau absinthe,
Yeah.
and they put stinging nettle and like the tarragon isn't too bad, but the stinging nettle I thought was kind of weird. Um, so that one kind of surprised me, and mint. Like it's one of the only absinthes that I know that uses mint, um, which I thought was rather interesting
Yeah.
as a choice. But theirs is a little bit more, as I said, nouveau.
Mhm.
For alcohol in general, um, I think it's in Peru, I want to say, they will make alcohol out of monkey puzzle,
Oh wow.
which kudos for them to them for actually being able to pull that off. That's not an easy tree to work with. I know, I've done it.
That'd be a
Um,
process.
yeah. But yeah, that's a very interesting plant to try and make alcohol out of. So I think
Yeah.
that one kind of took the cake for me.
All
It
right.
really kind of stuck with me.
All right. Out of curiosity, what's the company name for the one that you just held up? Because I remember really
Oh, St.
liking
George.
something. Okay,
Yeah, this one
St.
is
George.
St. George Absinthe Fair.
Okay.
Um, oh God, what's the name of the company? I am blanking. Should say on the bottle. Yeah, it's just St. George Spirits.
All
They're
right.
in Alameda, California. If you ever get the chance to go over to them, they are actually right across the lot where Mythbusters would shoot their stuff.
All right.
And they are more than happy to set up a tasting for you normally. I don't know what they're doing in COVID times, but when I had the opportunity to go there, they laid out like 10 different absinthes and were like, hey, try these. Uh,
Nice.
I thought it was pretty awesome. My husband, however, got very sick shortly afterwards. Apparently, he picked up a stomach bug somewhere along the line,
Oh,
and now he cannot stand the smell of absinthe. It makes him very ill. Hence why, like, I think it tastes good. There are some
yeah,
people who don't. So,
fully understandable.
yeah, that was a very exciting journey.
Oh, all right. Um, are there any interesting absinthe related stories, historical, ethnobotanical, whatnot, that you'd like to share with the class
Um, well, I mean,
audience?
my own
Yeah.
absinthe stories have been kind of exciting. Um, I didn't really have a much of a budget to kind of like explore absinthe with, so I was kind of going on a shoestring.
Yeah.
So I actually did some of my research before I even started working on my master's because I knew what I wanted to do my thesis on. Like I had a plan. Um, it's like the trip up to Okanagan Spirits I did in a day. That's like a 6 hour drive one way. So drove all the way up there, did my little interview, tried their absinthe, bought a bottle, brought it back, drove all the way back. It was a very long day. Um, Going to St. George, pretty much the same thing. It was
Mhm.
a 14-hour drive with me, my husband, and one of our friends. And we got down there just fine 14 hours later. Tried a whole bunch of absinthe, and then, like, on our way back up, my husband was feeling very poorly, and also our car started to die. And
Oh
so
no.
we got stuck in like the middle of nowhere, and I mean like nowhere, with a dead alternator and my husband puking in the back seat. Um, all this in the name of absinthe. Uh, my trip up to Southwold to go to Adnams Distillery. Uh, I actually went with one of our classmates and we got lost on the way. So we missed our tour time by like an hour. It was a
Oh
2 hour
no.
long tour. But because of that, actually, it ended up being even better because the head distiller there was like, "Oh, well, you're too late for that tour. So let's just like sit down and talk and drink a bit." So he had us try a range of things, both absinthe and otherwise, or absinthe and otherwise. And both of us were feeling pretty tipsy by the time we got done there. Um, and he was an absolute sweetheart and gave us his employee discount at the distillery where I got my absinthe.
Very
Um,
nice.
and again, being a student on a shoestring budget, I appreciate the heck out of that.
Oh
Um, Going to like when I actually did my trip that we were supposed to do for our thesis, I had a car accident,
yeah. Hmm.
and that cut my trip short. Which actually might have been a blessing in disguise because trying to get people to go through 9 different absinthes and like rate them based on their taste and all that was really tricky. And was supposed to stop at like 4 more distilleries and pick
Hmm.
up, I don't know, half a dozen more absinthes. And I'm looking at that now and I'm like, that was not going to go well. I had trouble getting people to drink 9 because by the time they got to like number 5, they're just like, whoa. So yeah, my own personal experiences with absinthe and like the craziness that this journey has
Yeah.
taken me on have been really amusing.
Oh yeah.
Historically, one of the really interesting things about absinthe that they kind of leave out of a, a lot, honestly, is that absinthe, and as I mentioned earlier, it became more popular than wine in like the 1860s. But the reason for that was a little bug called phylloxera, and that is something that you find in New World grapes
Hmm.
and that they did not know about. And so when they brought New World grapes back to the Old World, which did not have phylloxera and had not developed any sort of immunity, um, they really, really wrecked everything. And so the grape industry and thus the wine industry was having a meltdown of epic proportion.
Hmm.
And instead of using wine to make brandy and your brandy to make absinthe, they started using neutral grain spirits. So your leftover, wheat, rye, what have you, distilled, put your herbs in it, make your absinthe.
Hmm.
And so one of the big reasons that absinthe was taken off the market wasn't because it was like causing hallucinations or anything like that. It was actually propaganda from the wine industry, who, once they got back on their feet, were like, well, nobody's buying our wine because absinthe is such a better value. I mean,
Hmm.
like we talked about earlier, you can have 32 servings per bottle or you can have four.
Yeah.
Um, so the wine industry really got behind it, and France was having a real issue with alcoholism at the time,
Hmm.
like as an entire country having this issue with alcoholism.
Yeah.
It was not unheard of for people to give absinthe to their kids. Um, they actually had to lower the height requirement to be in the French army, um, because birth defects from fetal
Oh
alcohol
wow.
syndrome had reduced the average height of men so much that they actually had to bring that down a notch. Um, and so, like, it's this whole cultural thing that we don't necessarily talk about when we talk about absinthe. A lot of people will focus on absinthism, they'll focus on hallucinations, and not necessarily focus on like an entire region's challenges with alcoholism and
Hmm.
how absinthe was the one that got blamed for that. Never mind the fact that wine is still alcohol, still a
Hmm.
problem with alcoholism.
Oh
And it just kind of like got shoved under a bus,
yeah. Mm.
um, which is interesting, um, but also just kind of sad because I think
Yeah.
we really kind of missed out on that a little bit.
Yeah. Because it
Maybe.
my I know my only experience with absinthe until like
Till I came along.
yeah, until like early mid 20s really, with like listening to you talk about your research and everything, was whatever's available in general media, which
Yeah.
not the best of representations, which seems to be a common thread in a lot of things when it comes to media representation, admittedly.
Yeah.
uh, so just to jump off that real quick, um, was it developed in France? I can't remember for the
So
initial.
it's right on the edge of the border between France and Switzerland.
Mm, okay.
The Val de Travers area, and it was a French doctor who crossed over to Switzerland, um, found a woman there who was kind of making her own absinthe. She had a recipe. He, if I remember correctly, kind of put it through that distillation process and then
Hmm.
claimed the whole thing as his own.
Oh, right,
Yeah.
right.
But yeah, so it was in that area,
Hmm.
um, that it was the birthplace of absinthe, and a guy getting credit for a woman's work. History. Ugh.
Basically, yeah. All right. So, I this is the final question. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the general populace about absinthe or anything else of interest?
Um,
Really?
Please don't shoot your absinthe. It is not meant to be taken as a shot. It'll mess you up because most of it's sitting at like 72%, so like 145, 150 proof. Don't do shots of
Yeah.
absinthe, please. You're you're missing the point and you're missing the beauty because all you will taste is the burn of alcohol in the back of your throat. And without the ice cold water to really kind of let the essential oils come out into the mix, you're
Mhm.
really missing out if you do that. Like, I realize it's a really quick way to get drunk. Please don't do it. Same with lighting it on fire. Please don't light your absinthe on fire. That's bad, yo. Um, yeah, I'm happy to see more of a variety of absinthe. I'm happy to see more people trying it. I'm happy. I would be much happier to see much more media representation that was not like, "Hey, we're gonna trip balls on this." Um, that would be great.
Yeah.
But I mean, I am not in control of media representation, so at the moment we're just going to have to deal with it.
Is what it is.
Yeah. Looking
All
at you,
right.
Moulin Rouge.
Yeah, yeah. Between Moulin Rouge and I, I think that it was either right after or right around when Eurotrip was released.
Oh yeah.
That's when the flaming sugar cube situation happened.
Yeah, that was another one that was really bad. And like, I get it because if they were in the Czech Republic and doing what the Czechs are doing, which is
Yeah,
not historically accurate, but still, it's a thing.
yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah.
Huh. All right. Well, there's that. Would you like to tell people where they can find you on social media stuff, or not?
Sure. You can find me on Instagram. I am herb.nerd.girl. But most of my stuff isn't absinthe related. Most of it is like crafty shit. I like to cook. I like to sew. I like to be crafty. And all of that is on my Instagram stuff. And that's really the only thing that I really put out there. Most of the rest of my social media stuff is private.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Fiona, for joining us. Words for joining us today on this episode of Botany After Dark. It was fabulous and learned a lot. So,
Thank you for having me.
yeah, it was a fun time. And it was good to catch up with you because
Yes.
it's been a while.
Yes.
So, there we go. Without further ado, we shall end the podcast episode. Have a good day, evening, night, whatever time it is, everyone. Talk to y'all later. Rin out.